He said, "Sign the house over. I'll take care of you." He said it softly, the way men speak to their mothers when they've already decided what's best for them and just need the formality of her permission, the illusion of choice. I remember the way his hand hovered above mine, as if my hesitation might contaminate the papers, how his wife stood by the counter pretending not to listen, her body turned slightly away, but her ears sharpened like knives. I was 79 then, living in the same house my husband and I built brick by brick, the one that smelled of varnish and lilacs, and all the good years before money and pride began to rot the edges of love. I was tired, yes, but not foolish, though they mistook one for the other. He had come over that morning with fresh pastries and the kind of smile that feels like a transaction. "Mom, it's just easier if it's under my name. I can manage the taxes, the upkeep. You shouldn't have to worry about any of that." Easier. That word has ruined more lives than war. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think he was protecting me and not the property value. But there was something in the way he said, "Take care of you," as if I were already fading, as if my care were a burden, a thing to be handled quietly and efficiently, like a leaking pipe. I looked at the paper and saw my name spelled out in careful print, the ink black and absolute. And for a moment, I thought about how many times in my life I'd signed things to help him. School forms, loan applications, medical permissions when his father was sick. My signature had been a kind of inheritance he drew from whenever he needed to build his life. But this one was different. This one felt final, like an obituary written in advance. I didn't sign that day. I told him I wanted to think about it, and he said, "Of course, take your time. The way people do when they already know they'll ask again tomorrow." When he left, the kitchen stayed full of his cologne, a cold, expensive scent that didn't belong in a room where bread had risen for 40 years. I sat by the window, watching the neighbor's dog chase a leaf, and thought about how men learn to be gentle only when they want something irreversible. That night, I found the old folder where my husband had kept the original deed, his handwriting still visible on the margins, tiny notes about mortgage rates and repairs, and I ran my fingers over it as if touching him might help me decide what to do. The house had never been just walls to me. It was a living memory, a repository of every small dignity I'd managed to protect. I knew that if I signed it away, I would be giving up more than property. I would be handing over the last proof that I had once mattered beyond my usefulness. Yet I also knew how exhaustion can seduce you into surrender. For months after my surgery, I had lived between the hours, half conscious, half healed, while my son came and went with groceries and prescriptions, keeping track of my recovery like a manager ticking off tasks. His kindness had a schedule, and when it ended, it was replaced by efficiency. I started to feel like a guest in my own house, apologizing for moving too slowly, for leaving dishes to dry in the wrong place. The neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, noticed first. She was 78, brittle and bright, the kind of woman who never softened her truths. "You look like someone waiting to be erased," she said one afternoon when I was sweeping the porch. I laughed, but her words clung to me. Waiting to be erased. That's exactly what it felt like. Every conversation with my son carried a faint echo of future absence. "When you're not here," he would begin, meaning when you're gone, when you're no longer an inconvenience between us and what we think we deserve. Even the way he looked around the house had changed, His eyes no longer saw the kitchen where he'd learned to make pancakes at 10, or the hallway where we measured his height every birthday. He saw resale value, square footage, potential. I caught him once calculating out loud the price per square foot of the neighboring property, and when I asked what he was doing, he said, "Just curious, Mom." Curiosity is just greed rehearsing its lines. Still, I wanted to trust him. That's the curse of motherhood. You confuse forgiveness with faith. So when he brought the documents again, I didn't say no immediately. I let him talk. He spoke about taxes, legal simplifications, the possibility of me moving somewhere smaller, safer, more suited to your age. He said it with such care that I almost believed him until I realized he was already speaking about me in the past tense. I looked at his wife, standing behind him with her arms folded, her lips tight in a smile that wasn't really a smile at all, and something inside me began to hum, a low, steady warning like a wire about to snap. I knew that look. I had seen it before, in my own reflection years ago, when I was tired of my husband's stubbornness, when I wanted control of something that wasn't mine. Power always disguises itself as concern. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the old clock tick, each second an argument I hadn't yet had. I thought about my son as a boy, how he used to fall asleep on the couch after watching nature documentaries, his mouth slightly open, one hand still clutching a cookie. I remembered how I used to carry him to bed, careful not to wake him, whispering that he was safe, that I'd always take care of him. I had meant it. I still meant it, though he clearly didn't. Somewhere between those years and this moment, the promise had twisted into something unrecognizable. I was the one who needed protection now, and he had decided to be the protector, but only if ownership came with it. I could almost hear him rehearsing the story for others. We took care of Mom, gave her everything she needed. And they would nod, those polite strangers, and never ask whose name was on the deed, whose savings built the foundation, whose hands painted every wall. I suppose that's why the betrayal felt so quiet. It wasn't loud or cruel or dramatic. It was polite, tidy, administrative. That's the most dangerous kind. In the morning, I opened the curtains and looked at the street, at the life I had built that was slowly being translated into someone else's vocabulary. The lilac bush was blooming early that year, reckless with color, as if trying to remind me that not everything can be pruned into submission. I stood there for a long time, the papers on the table behind me, the pen waiting like a threat. And then, without fully knowing why, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I suddenly saw the absurdity of it all. A lifetime of work, love, and loss reduced to a signature. I decided I would sign, yes, but not to him. Not yet. I wanted to see what it felt like to make a decision that was entirely my own, one that didn't begin with someone else's need. That laugh carried me through the day. When he called that evening to check in, I told him everything was fine, that I was resting, that I'd think about the papers tomorrow. He seemed satisfied. I hung up, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table until the house went quiet again. In the corner, the radio hummed softly, the way it had when my husband was alive, and I thought, maybe it's time someone finally took care of me, and maybe that someone should be me. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels unremarkable until you realize later it was the hinge your whole life swung on. The sky was a flat, indifferent gray, and I was wearing the same cardigan I always wore when I wanted to appear calm. My son arrived early, earlier than usual, carrying a leather folder and 2 cups of coffee. "Mom," he said, in that careful voice people use when they've practiced their lines. "I thought we could finally take care of the paperwork. It'll only take a few minutes." I was still half asleep, my hair unbrushed, the television humming softly with some morning news I wasn't listening to. I told him I hadn't decided yet. He smiled, that gentle, rehearsed smile of his, and set the coffee on the table. "You don't need to decide, Mom. You just need to sign what's already right." There's a tone grown children sometimes use with their parents, a strange mixture of affection and condescension. Like you're an old pet they're fond of but can't quite trust not to ruin the carpet. That's how he sounded. Behind him stood Dana, his wife, holding her phone, pretending to scroll but glancing up every few seconds, as if to ensure the scene was proceeding as planned. The documents were already spread out, neat stacks of white paper held down by a silver pen. I remember how my son opened the folder, his fingers steady, his voice patient. "It's really just a transfer of title. You'll still live here as long as you like. It's just that I'll handle the maintenance, the taxes, all the practicalities. You shouldn't be bothered with all that now." I wanted to ask what he meant by now, but I didn't. My mouth felt dry, and the smell of coffee, once comforting, seemed suddenly invasive, heavy with something that wasn't warmth. He pushed the pen toward me like a waiter sliding a check across the table. The gesture was so familiar it almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I looked at the line where my name was printed. Full name, maiden name included. The name I had used when I signed the loan with my husband 40 years ago. It looked strange to me now, out of place, like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to me. I asked him if he'd read everything carefully, if he understood what these papers meant. "Of course," he said quickly. "I've been talking with the lawyer. It's standard. We just need your signature to make everything official." The lawyer. He said it as if invoking a priest, as if legality were morality. I should have insisted on reading every page, but instead, I just flipped through them, not seeing words, only feeling weight. The pages were thick, expensively thick, and the font so small it blurred into pattern. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he reached out and placed his hand over mine. "Mom," he said softly, "trust me. You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." The phrase hit me like a stone. I'd heard it once before, long ago, from my husband, when we refinanced the house to pay for Michael's university. Back then, too, it had sounded like love. Later, I learned it was more like pleading. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that what I was feeling, the strange pressure in my chest, the slight tremor in my fingers, was just fear of change. People like to say that age brings wisdom, but what it really brings is fatigue, and fatigue makes you compliant. So I nodded, and he smiled, and that smile was all it took. He placed the document before me, and I signed, my handwriting smaller than usual, as if even my name were retreating from the act. Dana took a photo. "For the records," she said. And then she smiled too, the smile of someone watching a door close quietly behind them. When they left, they hugged me, both of them at once, a double embrace that felt more like containment than comfort. "You did the right thing," Michael said. "You'll see how much easier everything gets now." The sound of their car pulling away was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. I sat at the table for a long time afterward, staring at the cup of coffee he'd brought me. It had gone cold, and a thin film had formed on the surface, a dull skin that seemed to thicken the longer I watched it. I should have called someone, a lawyer, a friend, anyone. But who do you call when the betrayal is so intimate it feels like your own fault? I went to the sink, poured out the coffee, and watched it swirl down the drain, disappearing without protest. That's when I saw it. A second copy of the deed he'd left on the counter. A blank version. Perhaps an oversight. My name was printed at the top, but in the owner's section below, only his was filled in. Sole proprietor. I read those words over and over until they lost meaning, until they were just sounds, cruel and dry. I sat on the kitchen floor, the paper trembling in my hands, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because of shock, but because of recognition. He hadn't tricked me. Not really. He had simply learned from me. I had raised him to be capable, persuasive, confident. I had taught him to never hesitate when pursuing what he wanted. I had just never thought what he wanted might one day be mine. That night, when the wind picked up and the old house moaned in its wooden bones, I felt it grieving with me. Every creak sounded like a whisper of warning I hadn't heeded. I couldn't sleep. I went to the window and watched the neighbor's porch light flicker, a single warm spot in a street that suddenly looked unfamiliar. The deed lay open on the table, the ink still fresh, glinting under the lamp. My name was there, but it was only a ghost, a signature divorced from its body. I thought about calling Michael, telling him I'd changed my mind, that I wanted to revisit the agreement, but I could already imagine his voice, tired, patient, slightly patronizing, saying, "Mom, don't stress about it. Everything's fine." The next morning, I heard his car pull into the driveway again. He came in without knocking, as if the house already knew it belonged to him. "Just dropping off some documents," he said, avoiding my eyes. Everything went through perfectly. Went through. The words landed like a verdict. He left before I could reply, leaving behind a faint scent of his cologne and the metallic echo of finality. I sat there for a long time, unable to move, feeling the weight of silence settle around me. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick with judgment. I realized then that this was not just about property or papers. It was about erasure. With one stroke of a pen, I had made myself expendable. I thought of my husband again. How proud he'd been when we made the last payment on the mortgage. How he'd opened a bottle of cheap champagne and poured it into mismatched glasses. Because we own this now, sweetheart. We. He was gone. But that we had remained in the bricks, the windows, the creaking steps. Now even that had been rewritten. I tried to tell myself it was only a formality, that nothing would really change. But deep down, I knew better. Formalities are how cruelty dresses up for dinner. That night, I dreamed of the house crumbling inward, walls folding like paper, the lilacs turning to dust. When I woke, my pillow was damp. The room looked the same, but I could feel it. Something essential had shifted. The house no longer belonged to me, and in a way, neither did I. The next day, Mrs. Ellison knocked on my door, holding a basket of apples from her yard. She was always bringing something: pie, jam, news. She looked at me closely, the way old women look when they already know the truth, but want to hear you say it. "You signed, didn't you?" she asked. I didn't answer, just nodded. She sighed, set the basket down, and said, "Well, my dear, the ink's dry, but the story's not." Then she left me there, standing in my kitchen, holding the fruit of someone else's labor, realizing I had done the same, given everything I'd grown to people who would never taste it right, That was the moment I understood the betrayal wasn't in the signature. It was in the lie I'd told myself, that love could protect you from greed, that family could never be the hand that pushes you out of your own home. The changes did not arrive like a storm that knocks branches against windows and makes the decision for you. They came as a tide that seems still until you notice the shoreline has moved, and by then, the salt is already in your shoes. So the first week after I signed, Dana announced she was streamlining surfaces, and my blue teacup disappeared from the hook beside the stove. Then the needle cushion vanished from the drawer where it had lived for 20 years, and she said the words people use to tidy away lives, words like clutter and safety and hygiene. And while I tried to laugh and pretend I hadn't noticed, I found myself boiling water in a pot because the kettle had migrated to storage, which turned out not to be a place but an idea. A thin air where the inconvenient goes to prove it was never needed. And when I asked Michael about my sewing machine, he said he thought I hadn't used it in ages, which was true the way a lie is true when it pretends to be a kindness. Because of course after surgery I hadn't used it. But the machine was not just steel and thread. It was the shape my hands took when the world left me alone. And now, the corner where it had stood was a white triangle of light with a ficus in it. A ficus that did not know my name, and the thermostat clicked to a number that did not belong to my bones, cooler air thin as a reprimand. And when I shuffled over with the old stubbornness of a woman who remembers where she hid winter blankets, an app on Michael's phone reset it politely from across the room, while he explained energy efficiency with the zeal of a man who has just discovered a new god. And after that, the mail began arriving with my name tucked under theirs, as if I were a dependent, a suffix, and rearrangements of furniture happened while I was napping. And more than once I woke with the sensation of being moved inside my life the way a chair is dragged across a floor by men discussing square footage. And then on a Thursday, I returned from the doctor to find a stranger measuring my living room with a laser pointer and a smile like a laminated brochure. And when I asked who she was, she addressed me as sweetheart and said she was the staging consultant. And that was how I learned the house was about to be shown to a few select buyers. And Michael was sorry he hadn't told me sooner. It all happened so fast. The market is unusual. We have to be nimble. Words that sounded like weather when what he meant was auction. And he asked if I could keep to my room for an hour while they walked through because it was less confusing for prospective families to imagine themselves in the space without interruptions. And I nodded, because dignity is also a room one can be asked to wait in. And I carried a book to the small guest room that used to be the pantry and listened to the bright voices of people describing my dinner table as if it were a feature in a model home. And a woman in a camel coat tapped on my closed door by mistake and then laughed. Oh, sorry. Didn't realize someone was still here. Her still here, floating. After she walked away like the ghost label they'd already pinned to my shoulder. And later, Dana left brochures for senior communities on the counter with cheerful photos of women my age drinking lemon water near a synthetic pond. And she said it wasn't a suggestion, just information. And I said, information can bruise too. And she smiled like the school teacher she once was and said, let's focus on solutions. Then she replaced my cast iron skillet with a lightweight pan that dented if you looked at it too hard, because the realtor had mentioned buyers prefer brighter kitchens, and apparently darker cookware reads dated. And with every small swap, the house sounded different. Even footsteps altered their echo. And one evening, I opened the freezer to take out the bag of peas where I'd always kept copies of our will wrapped in wax paper. A trick my husband loved because he said no thief ever thinks to rob a vegetable. and found the drawer spotless and reorganized into acrylic bins labeled with Dana's label maker. No peas, no paper, no secret, only cubes of orderly ice. And my heart began a small, determined knocking, the kind you hear when a bird is trapped behind a grate, and I told myself not to be dramatic. But when I asked Michael if he'd come across an old envelope, he said he'd streamlined the files by transferring everything to a cloud. And the confidence with which he spoke the word cloud made me imagine our marriage certificate floating in a place where gravity never fails to drop things on the wrong men. And that evening, a social worker called my phone. Polite tone, scripted concern, because someone had requested a wellness check. No name given, of course. And she asked the questions that make sense only if you're ready to be diminished. Do you ever feel confused in your home? Has anyone encouraged you to assign powers of attorney? Do you understand your medications? And I answered carefully because I could hear Dana in the next room, and I understood that the walls had learned to listen before I had. So I said yes, 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 as if fluency were a test one could pass to keep one's own name. And on Sunday, I came down to find a box on the kitchen island with a masking tape label written in Michael's tidy accountant handwriting, legacy items. And inside were the things he decided belonged to memory rather than to rooms. The yellow mixing bowl with the chip, the set of brass measuring spoons that never matched, 3 photographs of my mother with flour on her cheek, and the wooden spoon worn to a shallow river where my thumb had lived for 40 years. And under the spoon, a note that read, "We'll store these safely off-site." And I felt something slide under my ribs like a drawer being closed. A decision happening without a sound. And the next week, he installed a video doorbell and asked me not to answer because contractors would be coming, and it was simpler if he handled it. And the word simpler returned like a gnat to the same fruit. And when I reached for the front door out of habit, my fingers met a new keypad that blinked patiently, and I realized I did not know the new code. And I stood there with my hand on the knob like a stranger rehearsing a memory in a museum. And later, at dinner, Dana corrected how I salted the soup because prospective buyers might stop by for a late showing and smells linger. And I thought of all the odors this house had held without complaint. The varnish of crib rails, the metallic panic of teenage hair dye, the butterscorch of birthday cakes. And now even garlic had become a liability, and Michael tried a softer path the way men do after they've learned that force leaves fingerprints. So he suggested we open a joint account, just to streamline bills. And when I said my pension was already allocated, he nodded sympathetically, as if I had confessed to hoarding string, and said, "Of course, Mom, no rush. We'll circle back." The phrase circle back looping in the air like a lasso. And I began to put things into my own small box. The faded notebook where I had copied recipes in my 20s, the brass key to the garden shed, the photograph of my husband holding a ladder and grinning like a man who thought gravity was a friend. And I slid the box under my bed as if it were a raft I could reach for when the water rose higher. And at night, I lay awake, listening to email pings and calendar chimes from Michael's phone as if my future had become a meeting he was always about to join. And in the mornings, the house wore new decisions I had not been introduced to. The hallway mirror replaced with something minimal, the door to the attic locked because the inspector had warned about liability. My name removed from the utility accounts because bundling services saves us 20%. And when the realtor held an open house on a Saturday, she asked me to take a little outing, and Michael cheerfully handed me a gift card to a chain cafe, and kissed my forehead as if he were sending a child on a field trip. So I sat for 2 hours under lights too bright for faces drinking coffee, too sweet for morning, and watched couples look into each other with the fierce optimism of people who have not yet learned the word off-site. And when I returned, there were booty covers by the door and a basket of rolled towels in the bathroom tied with twine, and my robe had been folded out of sight, because personal effects disrupt the aspirational narrative, and I was apparently an effect. And that night, Mrs. Ellison caught me on the front steps and said in her brisk way that she had noticed a van taking things from my garage, and did I authorize it? And I realized authorization had become a verb that no longer included me. And I told her slowly that I had signed the house to my son because he had promised to take care of me, and she snorted the way only old women who have already swallowed their quota of promises can snort. And she took my hand, papery and hot, and said, "My dear, caretaking is not a deed. It's a daily verb. If you can't feel it, it's not there." And I went back inside with her words like an ember in my pocket, and found on the kitchen island another stack of papers, glossy this time, with a floor plan sketched in blue and neatly labeled Owner's Suite. A phrase so indifferent to memory that I stood very still until my breath returned, because the room they called a suite had once been the room where my son had the flu, and I sat on the floor beside his bed peeling clementines into a bowl, letting the smell of citrus convince us both that we were not afraid. And now that room had become a bullet point in a brochure, and the past had been laundered until it smelled like lemons and money. And for the first time since my pen cut into those lines, a thought arrived that did not apologize for itself. If I could be signed away with such gentleness, perhaps gentleness could also be the cloak I wear when I learn how to move the pieces. They have not noticed I still hold, not yet an answer, not yet a plan, only the slow gathering of tinder in a house where they have forgotten old women keep matches. And while Michael spoke on a headset about closing timelines and Dana ordered neutral throw pillows to hide the life I had lived, I began to memorize the quiet, almost invisible seams where the fabric of their certainty could be picked apart, where the papers were kept, which name the utilities answered to, how the garden gate still yielded to the brass key in my pocket, and with every small inventory, the water stopped rising quite so fast, and the tide that had crept over my feet paused, uncertain, as if it had finally noticed that I was not, in fact, driftwood. It was Mrs. Ellison who broke the spell, though she would have laughed if I'd called it that. She had the kind of practical wisdom that sounded like impatience, and when she invited me over for tea one afternoon, I went mostly because I needed to sit in a house that hadn't been decluttered of its soul. Her kitchen was small and chaotic, full of steam and the clatter of unashamed living. She poured the tea strong enough to stand a spoon in and said, without prelude, that I looked like someone being slowly packed into a box marked miscellaneous. I told her she wasn't wrong, that my son had begun referring to the house as the property, as though the word home were a sentimental liability. She nodded, unimpressed by my restraint, and told me her brother had done something similar years ago, taken her name off a deed while pretending it was a favor. He said it was to simplify taxes, she said, pushing the sugar bowl toward me. What it simplified was his conscience. I learned quick that kindness spoken in the language of paperwork is just theft with better manners. I laughed because it was easier than crying, and she reached across the table, her fingers cool and surprisingly firm, and said, You still have your original copy, don't you? When I told her I wasn't sure, that I thought my son might have moved everything to digital files, she looked at me as if I'd confessed to misplacing a limb. Find it, she said. A signature doesn't erase what you can still prove. That night, I went home and began looking. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the low whine of the thermostat resetting itself every hour. I searched through drawers, behind books, under the lining of the old chest where I kept winter scarves. Nothing. Then I remembered the attic. The key still hung on the hook by the back door, a relic everyone had forgotten, and I climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick golden dust. The air smelled of insulation and old summers. I opened box after box until I found one labeled Mortgage Documents, 1986-1993, written in my husband's meticulous hand. Inside were receipts, yellowed statements, and beneath them, folded into a heavy envelope, the original deed. My name. His. No one else's. I sat on the floor, the flashlight flickering, and for the first time in months I felt something like gravity return to my body. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was evidence that I still existed on paper somewhere in the world's indifferent bureaucracy. I ran my hand over the ink, feeling the indentations my husband's pen had left, and I whispered aloud, "You didn't build this for nothing, love. You built it for us." The U.S. had shrunk, but it wasn't gone. The next day, I took the document to Mrs. Ellison. She made a phone call to a cousin, a retired notary who owed her a favor, and within hours we were sitting in a dim office that smelled faintly of ink and distrust. The notary, a stooped man with watery eyes, examined the paper carefully. "This is still valid," he said. "Technically, if the transfer was made under duress or without full disclosure, it can be contested." I told him I wasn't sure about court, that I didn't want to humiliate my son, only to feel safe again. "Then don't contest," he said. "Reassign." The word sounded alien, almost beautiful. He explained quietly that I could transfer temporary ownership into a trust or another individual's name until I sorted things out. "People do it all the time when they're afraid of exploitation," he said. Mrs. Ellison looked at me over her glasses and said, "I'll hold it. I'm nobody's fool, and I've outlived 2 lawyers." I laughed despite myself, that low, startled laugh that escapes when you realize someone is offering protection without asking for anything in return. I signed the new paper carefully, my hand shaking, but steady enough to make it count, and when I finished, the notary stamped it with a sound that felt like thunder, muffled through years of silence. The ink was wet and decisive. The deed was no longer my son's alone. I walked home with the document folded in my coat pocket, the world outside strangely crisp, the air clear in a way it hadn't been for months. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of being seen. I passed the for sale sign at the end of the street and almost smiled. That night, when Michael came by unannounced, he was in a hurry, his tone bright with forced optimism. "Good news," he said. "We've had an offer, above asking price." I let him talk, his sentences tumbling over each other, full of excitement and justification. He spoke of market trends, equity, relocation possibilities, as if reading a language I no longer cared to understand. When he paused for breath, I said softly, "That won't be necessary." He blinked. "What won't?" "The sale," I said. "You can tell your realtor the house is off the market." His smile faltered, then reassembled itself with professional precision. "Mom, it's already in motion. You can't just I can, I said, and I pulled the folded document from my pocket and laid it on the table between us. He stared at it like it was a weapon. What is that? It's ownership, I said. The original one. The one you forgot about. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, caught doing something wrong but unwilling to admit it. You don't understand how this works, he said finally. You're being manipulated. Who gave you this idea? I told him the truth. That Mrs. Ellison had helped. That I'd consulted a notary. That everything was legal and binding. His face darkened. Not with shame, but with something quieter and meaner. Disbelief that I had acted without his permission. Mom, this is crazy, he said. You can't trust that woman. You could lose everything. I met his eyes. Michael, I already did. He stood there for a long time, the silence swelling between us like a bruise, and then he turned, muttering that he needed to talk to his lawyer. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. I didn't realize until then how long it had been holding its breath. I made myself a cup of tea, the way Mrs. Ellison did, strong and unrepentant, and sat by the window as the evening settled into the garden. The rhubarb had started to push up through the soil again, stubborn and red. I thought about the word reassignment, how it wasn't theft or revenge, just a correction, a realignment of truth. I wasn't stealing from my son. I was reclaiming what had been stolen in plain sight. And yet, beneath the small triumph, there was grief too. Grief for the version of motherhood that had believed love was a permanent currency. I realized then that this was the midpoint, the quiet hinge of my life I would remember as the day I stopped being an accessory in someone else's story. I no longer felt invisible. The next morning, I went for a walk down the street. The neighbors waved. I waved back. I didn't tell them anything, but I think they saw it in the way I moved, the steadiness that had returned to my step. Mrs. Ellison was on her porch, pruning a rose bush, and when I passed, she looked up and said, "You look taller." "I'm standing on paper," I said, and she laughed so hard she nearly dropped her shears. That night, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, as though my mind had finally been allowed to lie down in its own bed. When I woke, the house felt different. Not safer, not exactly mine again, but awake. Like an animal that had recognized its true owner after a long confusion. I touched the wall beside my bed, the same plaster my husband and I had painted together decades ago, and whispered, "We're not done yet." For the first time in months, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was listening. The first counterpunch did not arrive as shouting or broken glass, but as a letter with an expensive watermark and a tone so polite it felt like a hand on the back of my neck, gentle and decisive, informing me that my recent actions involving the residential property known as had raised concerns about my capacity and the possibility that I had been unduly influenced by a neighbor who might be seeking personal gain, and somewhere between the sentence about my well-being and the phrase, "We hope to resolve this amicably," I understood that my son had decided to rename the truth until it obeyed him. So I folded the paper carefully, placed it on the kitchen table like an exhibit in a museum of small violences, and made myself tea the way Mrs. Ellison taught me, black and stubborn, while the refrigerator hummed like a witness who has seen too much and learned to say nothing. And by the time the second letter arrived, a formal notice that a petition for emergency guardianship could be considered if I continued to exhibit impaired judgment in financial matters. I had already started a small private archive in a shoebox under the sink that used to hold rags, because I had learned at last that women like me survive by keeping their proofs close and their stories closer. And so I wrote dates in a trembling but legible hand, clipped envelopes, printed emails, and tucked into that box a copy of the notary's stamp with the ink still smelling faintly of iron. And when Michael appeared on a Saturday with his lawyer, who was younger than his suit, and spoke in a voice that made sentences sound like glass lids sealing shut, the man sat at my table without asking, and addressed me by my first name as if he'd known me in a previous life where I wasn't paying for his afternoon. And he said he was sure we could clear up the misunderstanding today if I would simply rescind the temporary transfer and agree to a more structured arrangement whereby my son would become my legal agent for all complex matters. And while he explained this new structure as if he were demonstrating a shelving system at a home store, I watched Michael's face and saw not malice exactly, but a kind of frightened ambition, the panic of a man who has built his goodness on a ledger and now sees the numbers turning their backs. And I said, in the slow, careful diction that makes men underestimate you, that the arrangement he proposed was unnecessary because I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. And he answered not as a son, but as a spokesman, telling me that stress could be harmful at my age and that family cohesion required clarity. And when I mentioned the word clarity later to Mrs. Ellison, she barked a laugh so sharp I worried it had cut the air, and she said theirs was not clarity, but choreography, the difference being that choreography does not ask the music's consent. And I held that sentence in my mouth like a peppermint, while the lawyer pivoted to the idea of reunifying title and spoke in phrases I recognized from real estate brochures and emergency rooms, language that sounds benevolent because it has been cleaned with bleach. And when he paused to sip the water he had poured without being invited, I slid across the table a copy of the reassignment, noticed his pupils adjust with annoyance rather than surprise, and told him that any further contact should be written, and that I was in the process of retaining counsel of my own, which at that exact moment was more aspiration than fact, though by sunset it would be true, because Mrs. Ellison's cousin's widower's sister, who sells church raffle tickets with a zeal that embarrassed the devil, knew an elder law attorney who volunteers on Tuesdays at a clinic behind the library. And if you think that sentence is too long to be plausible, you have not lived long enough in a neighborhood where women swap justice the way men swap tools. But before any of that, before I could breathe the small relief of naming my dignity aloud, the lawyer glanced around my kitchen as if he were appraising the light, thanked me for my time with the exact intonation men use when dismissing waitresses, and stood. But Michael stayed behind a moment, hovering near the chair as if it might fly away, and said, more softly than I had heard him speak in months, that this was getting out of hand and people were talking, and Dana was worried, and the realtor was confused, and the community board had asked whether there was a family plan. And when I asked who these people were, he spoke the names of strangers as if they were relatives, and I realized that his witness circle had expanded to include anyone who mirrored his certainty back to him. And then he said the sentence I had been trying not to hear, that perhaps I should move in with them for a while, just until things settled, because that would send the right signal. And I felt my throat tighten with the memory of being told to wait in the lounge at an airport years after my bones had learned how to stand. And I said that the only signal being sent was the one he refused to read, and he looked wounded. That theatrical flinch of decent men who cannot distinguish between losing control and being harmed. And then he left, not slamming the door because he has always been careful with surfaces. And I sank into the chair and counted the clicks of the thermostat, like a metronome placed over a heart that will not change its tempo for anyone's comfort. The next phase was public, which is to say it was intimate in a new way, because Dana began to post photographs online of the baby gurgling in a sunlit kitchen with captions about the ache of caring for elders and the importance of stepping up for family even when it's hard. And though my name was never written, the comments clothed me in a costume of confusion and need, and suddenly, well-intentioned women from their church began appearing with casseroles and soft voices. And a deacon I barely knew asked if I had considered the blessings of assisted living. And one morning, a neighbor I liked less than his dog knocked to offer advice about liquidating assets before the market turned. And I learned how quickly a reputation can be auctioned off in a cul-de-sac, how effortlessly concern can slip its glove and show the hand of appetite. And on Tuesday, I went to the legal clinic, sat on a plastic chair under a poster about flu shots, and told my whole story to a woman with iron-gray hair and a face like a well-read book. And she said there was nothing distressed about my capacity that she could see, and that guardianship petitions are often scarecrows waved by people who haven't read their own statutes. And she helped me draft a letter asserting that I was of sound mind, appointing a neutral third party, her colleague, to be my medical proxy instead of my son, and she filed a notice with the county that any changes to title would require my explicit notarized consent. And then she told me to go to the bank, make my own safe deposit box, and put into it copies of every document I had touched since the day I married. So I did exactly that. And at the bank, the manager gave me the look people reserve for women who remind them of their mothers, except less compliant. And when he asked if I wanted to add my son to the signature card for convenience, I said convenience was the currency that had bankrupted me and that the box would be mine alone. And on the way out, I bought a small notebook with a blue cover at the pharmacy and began to write down the names of everyone who had tried to be helpful and what they had actually done. The escalation turned practical then, as if someone had flipped a switch from theater to kitchen light, because Michael called to say he'd scheduled pest control and a roof evaluation, both of which required access. During hours, I coincidentally had appointments, and I answered that the schedule of the house now matched mine, and that any vendors could coordinate with Mrs. Ellison because the title custodian must be present for work orders. And I could hear the shock in his breath when he realized that custodian was not a rhetorical flourish, and he said this was humiliating, and I said humiliation is when you discover a code has been changed and the door you paid for no longer knows your hand. And there was a pause in which two people who loved each other very much learned how far language can stretch before it becomes a rope. And then he hung up, and a day later, Adult Protective Services came, a woman in a cardigan so soft it could have survived a blizzard, and she asked if I felt safe. And I told her I felt safer than I had in months, and she looked around at my lists and files and said more quietly that her own aunt had lost a house to a nephew with a degree, and that they don't always get to ring the bell in time, and that if anyone tried to move me against my will to call her cell, and she wrote the number on a yellow sticky and pressed it into my palm like a sacrament, and I kept it under a magnet on the fridge next to the grocery list that now included ink, folders, and cinnamon, because survival requires both paper and pastry. The pressure curled in other ways, too, slower, more insinuating, like ivy, because one evening, Dana arrived alone with flowers so white they looked like apologies soaked in milk, and she asked if we could talk woman to woman, which always means someone plans to walk away with the better chair. And she spoke about stress and heart health, and how it would mean so much to the children if we could all present a united front. and my chest ached listening to her avoid the word money like a superstition. And I asked her directly whether the house had been promised to someone. And after a long, practiced stillness, she admitted that an investor had made a pre-offer that would allow Michael to pay off a business loan he had guaranteed for a partner, and that this was temporary, only a strategic move, and that of course I would be cared for regardless. And I thought of the word regardless and how it takes off its shoes before it enters certain sentences. And I told her that I had spent a lifetime as a resource that thanked people for using it. And I was done. And she hardened. You could see the set of the jaw chosen at the salon and the gym. And she said I was being ungrateful and that Michael had only ever wanted to protect me. And I answered that protection is a circle drawn around the person you love, not a line drawn through their name. And she left with the flowers, which I placed in the sink and watched wilt under a thin thread of water because I did not want to give them the dignity of a vase. Proximity made everything louder after that. Doors closing just a little too firmly. The whisper of leaves that might have been voices. The dog 2 houses down, learning to bark at silhouettes. And at night, I wrote letters to myself in the blue notebook. Not dramatic letters, but inventory of courage. Sentences like today, I refuse to be hurried. And today, I learned the name of the clerk who files deeds. And today, I ate a pear over the sink and let the juice run down my wrist, because sweetness is a fact too. And in the morning, I copied phone numbers into 2 places, because women who survive do redundancy the way birds do. Migration. And when the county record confirmed receipt of my notice, and the bank confirmed the box, and the clinic sent a summary letter on letterhead that made men behave, I felt the ground tilt back toward level, not entirely, never that, but enough so that when Michael appeared again, alone this time, and sat at the edge of his old chair like a schoolboy expecting a test, I could listen to the tremble in his first sentence without mistaking it for sincerity. And he said he missed me, and I said I missed us, which is a different animal. And he asked if there was a path back, and I told him there was, but it didn't run through my checkbook. And he cried then, briefly, the way strong men do when they are startled by their own water. And I put my hand over his, the way I did when he was small and afraid of thunder. And I said that I would not live with him. I would not surrender my name. And I would not be a performance of vulnerability to feed other people's appetite for their own goodness. And he nodded like a man at the end of a sermon who cannot decide whether to kneel or leave. And when he spoke again, it was the old voice, the soft one. And he asked if I would at least consider meeting with his pastor. And I said I would meet with his heart if he could find it without a witness. And we sat there breathing until he stood and kissed my hair and left. And the quiet that followed was not peace, but it was not war either. More like a truce signed in pencil. Then came the article. Of course it did. A small piece in the community section about the importance of safeguarding elders, featuring a blurred photo of a house that looked remarkably like mine and quotes from a local family about the sudden behavioral changes of an aging parent. And though no names were printed, the comments section did the math with brutal efficiency, and strangers prayed for me in public, which is just another way to name you broken. And Mrs. Ellison clipped the article and wrote in the margin, with a felt-tip pen thicker than mercy, "They are trying to steal your narrative. Borrow my pen." And we laughed at the kitchen table until the steam from the kettle fogged the window and drew a curtain between us and the street. And after the laughter, we wrote 3 letters. One to the editor, measured and calm. One to the lawyer, firm and final. And one to myself, the longest one, where I explained in sentences that did not wobble that I had been trained to be grateful for rescue even from rooms that were not on fire, and that today I chose to be the woman who packs her own parachute and watches the door. And when the day ended, I tucked that letter into the shoebox and slept with my hand on the lid, like a farmer guarding seed, because the escalation had taught me that harvest belongs to the patient and the prepared, and that somewhere just ahead there would be a clean action, a single movement of ink or key that could not be undone without first admitting I existed, and that, more than winning, was what I wanted. To be undeniable in my own life, even to the people who loved me most when I was quiet. The day of the decision came without ceremony, which is how most revolutions arrive when they are personal rather than public, and I woke not with anger or trembling, but with the calm that follows a long illness, the kind that tells you recovery is not something given, but something you take. And as sunlight crossed the wall, I understood that waiting for apology or understanding had become another form of submission. So I rose, put on the coat I had bought the week my husband died, the one he used to call my bravery coat, and opened the box of papers under the sink for the last time. Every document, every receipt, every letter was arranged with the precision of a woman who had learned that order could be a weapon. I placed them in a folder marked simply proof, tied it with the ribbon from the flowers Dana had left weeks ago, and sat down to write a statement. It wasn't a letter or a complaint. It was a declaration, written slowly in blue ink, where I said that the property known as 412 Ashcroft Lane had been purchased in 1986 by two working adults who had believed in the fairness of sweat, and that its ownership had been altered under emotional coercion, and that as of this date it was being transferred into a charitable trust bearing my husband's name, designed to preserve affordable housing for widows in the county. The words came without hesitation, as if they had been waiting behind the dam of my politeness, and when I signed my name at the bottom, my hand no longer shook. I called Mrs. Ellison first, then the attorney from the clinic, and within hours we were at the county records office, a beige building that smelled of toner and coffee and quiet despair. The clerk looked up when I handed him the documents, glanced at the notary seal, and said the line every bureaucrat eventually learns to love. "Do you wish to record this transfer today?" I said yes, and as he stamped the papers, the sound echoed like a hammer on wood. There it was, the moment of irreversible motion, the hinge of my second life. When we stepped outside, the air tasted metallic, like rain on old pipes, and Mrs. Ellison grinned with the satisfaction of a gambler who's just remembered her odds. "Well, my dear," she said, "you just made it impossible for them to sell what isn't theirs." We went to the diner afterward, and she ordered pie, insisting that liberation without sugar is a waste of nerves, and we laughed until my ribs ached because it felt ridiculous and holy at once, this small, precise act of rebellion carried out in sensible shoes and with perfect grammar. That evening, I waited. I knew Michael would come. He always came when control slipped through his fingers. He arrived just before sunset, the sky bruised violet behind him, holding the latest letter from his lawyer, as if it were proof of divinity. "What have you done?" he asked. No greeting, no pretense, just the flat tone of a man who can smell smoke, but not yet the source. I told him calmly that the house was now part of a registered trust, and that any sale or mortgage was legally impossible without a board vote, of which I was the chair. He blinked, then laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that cracked in the middle. "You're joking," he said. You can't, Mom, you can't just give it away. I met his eyes. It was never yours to give or take. For a moment, I saw him search my face for the softness he depended on. But it wasn't there. It had been replaced by something quieter and steadier, like the surface of ice before spring. He started pacing, running his hands through his hair, muttering that this would ruin him, that people would think he'd exploited his mother, that Dana would never forgive him, that I was destroying the family's reputation. Every sentence began with him, and I realized he hadn't used my name once. "You lied to me," he said finally. "You made me believe you were confused, and all along you were planning this." I smiled, not out of malice, but recognition. "No, Michael. You made me believe confusion was the only language I was allowed to speak. I simply learned yours." He stopped then, stunned by the quiet of my voice. For years I had spoken to him in apologies and qualifications, but that day each word was whole. He called me cruel, ungrateful, vindictive, and I let the words hang between us like birds that would never find their perch. When he realized I wasn't going to defend myself, he sat down heavily at the table, the same table where I had once taught him how to hold a pen, and whispered, "What am I supposed to tell everyone?" I said he could tell them the truth, that his mother had finally remembered she existed. He didn't answer. He just stared at the deed lying between us, his reflection trembling in the glass of the picture frame beside it. And for a brief, treacherous moment, I wanted to reach out and touch his hair, to comfort him. But I knew if I did, I would undo everything. So instead, I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Eventually, he stood, gathered the papers as if tidying a crime scene, and left without another word. I listened to his car fade down the street, each sound growing fainter until even the air forgot it. After he was gone, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, touching the edges of furniture as though memorizing a language about to go extinct. The house no longer frightened me. It had become a body that had survived surgery and was learning how to breathe again. I opened the windows and let the wind move through, shaking loose the stale perfume of old arguments. Then I did something impulsive. I took out my husband's old fountain pen, the one with the brass nib that left tiny pools of ink at the end of every sentence, and wrote Michael a note. Not an explanation, just a boundary carved in sentences. I told him that love is not ownership, that I hoped one day he would understand the difference between inheritance and entitlement, and that I forgave him because I refused to carry him like a chain. I left the note on the table beside a slice of rhubarb pie, still warm, because forgiveness, like pastry, should be offered fresh even if it isn't accepted. Then I packed a small bag, my notebook, the deed copies, and the house key that no longer held power over me, and walked across the yard to Mrs. Ellison's porch, where she was waiting with 2 mugs of tea and a look that said she had known this was the day. "So," she said, "what now?" I told her I was moving into the brick unit she'd found for me near the park, the one with the garden and the gate that clicked shut with finality. She nodded, satisfied, and helped me load my boxes into her car. When we drove away, I didn't look back immediately. Only at the stop sign did I turn my head. The house stood quiet, its windows reflecting the last light of the day, and for the first time in months it looked honest, emptied of pretense, stripped of its illusions of safety. I thought of my husband then, of how he used to say that walls remember laughter longer than anger, and I hoped the laughter was still somewhere in the beams, waiting for whoever would live there next. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the cool edge of the trust document. It was no longer just paper. It was a new kind of architecture, one built from refusal. That night, in my new home, I unpacked only what mattered. The photograph of my husband smiling under the half-painted ceiling, the notebook of recipes in my younger handwriting, the brass key, useless now, but still warm with memory. I placed them on the windowsill beside a small pot of lavender and sat in the armchair. Mrs. Ellison had insisted on donating because every beginning needs a throne. Outside, the street was quiet except for the crickets rehearsing their endless song. For the first time in years, I felt the world move without me having to brace against it. I wrote in my notebook, "Today, I reclaimed my name from the mouths that mispronounced it. Today, I was not someone's mother or liability or lesson. Today, I was mine." Later, as the night deepened, I thought of Michael again. Not the man who had tried to take the house, but the boy who once asked if walls could get lonely when people stopped talking to them. I wanted to believe that somewhere beneath his calculations, that boy still waited, not yet erased by the arithmetic of adulthood. Maybe one day he would understand that my defiance was also an act of love, the kind that teaches you no amount of property can make a person safe, only truth can. But even if he didn't, I would sleep knowing that the story ended with my signature, not his. Before bed, I opened the window and let the night air in, carrying the faint scent of rhubarb from the neighbor's garden. It smelled like closure, earthy, sweet, a little bitter. I whispered into the darkness, to the house I had left and to the life I had reclaimed. We're square now. And the silence that answered was not empty, but full, the kind that holds room for everything that survived the fire without burning. It has been 6 months since that day, and the rhythm of my new life has settled into something that feels neither victory nor loss, but continuity. The quiet heartbeat of a woman who has at last stopped explaining herself. The brick unit where I live now is small but deliberate, each object chosen rather than inherited, and when I wake, the first thing I see is the garden I planted from cuttings that survived the move, the lavender, the rhubarb, a stubborn hydrangea that refuses symmetry. I tend it slowly, not as therapy, not as metaphor, but simply because things that root themselves deserve company. Some mornings Mrs. Ellison joins me, still full of gossip and salt, carrying 2 mugs of tea that taste faintly of the kettle's age. We speak less about what happened now. It has shifted from story to sediment, something that settles quietly at the bottom of the day and no longer needs stirring. She tells me her knees ache, and I tell her mine don't. And we both know that pain is just another language we've learned to use sparingly. The house I left stands 3 streets away. Sometimes when I walk past on my way to the post office, I see the new family who rents it from the trust. There's a young woman who hangs laundry in the yard, a man who fixes the fence with careful patience, and a little girl who runs barefoot on the grass that Michael once called liability. I never speak to them, though once the woman waved, and I nodded back. The lilac bush I planted decades ago blooms wider each spring, almost defiant in its abundance, and I imagine the scent slipping through their windows the way it once slipped through mine, a quiet inheritance that needs no signature. The rent they pay goes directly into the trust, which now funds repairs for widows' homes across the county. And sometimes a letter arrives, a thank you note written in shaky cursive, from someone I will never meet, telling me that her roof no longer leaks or that her heating works again. I keep those letters in a drawer, not as trophies, but as proof that even broken things can hold shelter for others. Michael calls occasionally, the way people call the past when they're not ready to live in it, but can't bear to let it die. His voice is careful, measured, always beginning with practicalities. Weather, prescriptions, the baby's milestones, and sometimes, if the conversation drifts long enough, something gentler seeps through. A pause before goodbye that sounds like remorse's first syllable. I don't punish him by withholding affection. I've learned that withholding is just another kind of debt, and I'm finished with debts. I tell him about the garden, about the trust's small victories, and he listens, though I can hear the unease behind his politeness, the awareness that I now live entirely outside the orbit of his control. Once, he asked if I would ever move back into the old house if circumstances changed. I told him that houses, like people, remember how they were treated. Some doors once locked should stay that way, not out of anger, but because the air inside has finally cleared. He didn't argue. We ended the call quietly, and that silence felt like a truce, written in ink too faint to bleed. I have begun to write again, not the frantic notes of self-defense I once filled my notebooks with, but long letters to no one in particular. Letters to women I've never met, but somehow know exist. I write to the widow who is told she is lucky to have anyone care about her finances, to the mother whose children say, "For your own good," with voices that sound like paperwork, to the woman standing at a kitchen counter with a pen she doesn't want to hold. I tell them that survival is not rebellion, that it's just the act of continuing to have a name when others prefer you nameless. I tell them that fear will not protect them from being forgotten, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to outlive the version of yourself who believed obedience was love. These letters pile up on my table, unsent, though Mrs. Ellison keeps threatening to make a book of them, and I suppose that wouldn't be the worst kind of immortality. On Sundays, I walk to the park near the river, where children ride bicycles with the ferocity of the newly free. I sit on a bench with my tea and watch them learning balance, how they lean too far, how they fall, how they rise without looking for applause. There's something holy in that repetition. Once a little girl, maybe 6, fell near my feet and burst into tears, her knee scraped and blooming red. I reached into my bag, found a handkerchief, and wiped the blood away. The gesture so automatic, it startled me. Her mother came running, breathless, thanking me, and the girl sniffled and asked if I lived nearby. I said I did, and she smiled through the last of her tears and said, "You smell like pie." It made me laugh, and when they left, I realized I did. The rhubarb from my morning baking clinging to my sleeves like a small announcement that sweetness still existed. Evenings are the best time here. I light one lamp, open the window, and let the air fill the space where fear used to live. Sometimes I imagine my husband sitting across from me, the way he did when we were young, his fingers drumming a rhythm only he knew. I tell him about the world now, about laws and sons and how easily love can turn into management, and I like to think he listens, that he understands this was never vengeance, only correction. The trust bears his name, and perhaps that's fitting. He always believed a home should outlast the people who built it, not as a monument, but as a working thing, a place that continues to breathe after you've stopped. Tonight the moon is full enough to silver the garden. The hydrangea glows pale blue, and the lavender trembles slightly in the wind. From my chair, I can see the faint line of smoke from someone's chimney, curling into the dark like a promise. I think of the women whose letters sit in my drawer, and I wish I could gather them all here. Pour tea. Let them rest their hands on this table that has held every version of me. I would tell them that forgiveness is not capitulation, it's architecture. You build it not to invite trespassers back in, but to keep yourself from living in ruins. I would tell them that when someone says, "Sign here," they are really asking what you believe your worth is, and that the pen should always tremble for the right reasons. I am not lonely here. Loneliness was the sound of being invisible inside a house full of people who used my name like punctuation. Solitude, I've learned, is different. It's an echo that finally belongs to you. When I turn off the lamp, the room darkens slowly, politely, as if asking permission. I breathe in, and the air smells of paper, tea, and the faint sweetness of drying rhubarb. I whisper a small benediction to the night. May every woman find the courage to keep her own key. And as the silence folds around me, I realize this is peace. Not the kind that forgets, but the kind that remembers everything and still chooses to rest.